Sup chooms, how y'all living? Hope everything is Nova and you're all having a preem week. So, a lot of people who are new to my channel sometimes come to the false conclusion that I am an atheist. I'm actually not. I am religious, although I have nothing against people who are atheists. I actually used to be one myself, and perhaps that's a tale for another time, but the reason I bring this up is because one thing all religions have in common is that they've all been accused of being wrong, some more than others. Scientology and Eric Berg, I am looking in your direction. I am a Christian, and Christianity has been accused of being wrong many times too, although bashing Christianity definitely isn't as cool on the internet as it was back in the 2010s, right after Gamergate when edgelord neckbearded incels took over YouTube. And you know what? That's all perfectly fine. I'm not going to pretend that there's some logical or scientific explanation behind my religion, or any other religion for that matter. I mean, that's why they call it faith after all. You could think that's silly, but at least I'm honest about it. And that, my fellow hair loss witchers, is why I cannot stand the carnivore diet. It's because they too are a faith-based religion, but they are not honest about it. They refuse to admit that they're in a cult, or more specifically, a misanthropic, sociopathic death cult for internet trolls and overweight maha moms. When it comes to determining who their god is, that's debatable. Maybe it's the disgraced Dr. Sean Baker, as he was the first big social media figure I can think of to promote the carnivore diet. Or maybe it's Weston A. Price. He was a dentist whose only notable claim to fame before the rise of the carnivore cult were his failed dental theories. He falsely claimed that bacteria in teeth cause diseases throughout the entire body, like arthritis, heart disease, and cancer. This unfortunately resulted in millions of healthy teeth being extracted unnecessarily from tens of thousands of people, dramatically worsening their quality of lives. So, since he was a failed dentist, he decided to become one of the world's first nutrition bro scientists. He did this by glamorizing the diets of primitive people while totally ignoring their high infant mortality rates, malnutrition, short lifespans, and chronic illnesses in the indigenous populations he was observing. So in other words, he cherry-picked data, just like modern-day carnivores do. No wonder they like him so much. So, in many ways, he is sort of the godfather of the carnivore death cult, if not their messiah. So, we could probably squabble all day about who the god of the carnivore diet is. That's completely debatable, I'll admit that. What isn't debatable, though, is who the Satan of the carnivore death cult is. Without question, the most reviled human being to ever exist amongst carnivores is a physiologist, nutritionist, and medical researcher named Ancel Keys. Ancel Keys is to carnivore dieters what Hitler is to Jews, or what Jews are to liberals. They hate him so much that you can't even mention his name to a carnivore moron without causing him to foam up at the mouth like a rabid squirrel. Of course, it's very easy to hate and attack someone who is dead and is no longer around to defend himself, but that's no surprise, because carnivore dieters are all, without exception, terminally online, smartphone-addicted keyboard warriors who were raised completely by the internet and have grown way too comfortable talking shit about people from the comfort of their screens. So, the vast majority of carnivore dieters are just dickless internet tough guys who don't even have the balls to show their faces online. But there are a few high-profile figures amongst the carnivore death cult who have made a career condemning a health pioneer like Ancel Keys. Let's go over them and examine their claims, shall we? One of the biggest critics of Ancel Keys is this Karen right here named Nina Teicholz, who wrote this shitty book called The Big Fat Surprise. Yeah, that's the book her husband should have written about her describing his wedding night. So, she is one of the clowns who has demonized Ancel Keys thoroughly so she could sell her shitty supplements to her brainless Gen Z incel audience. And she doesn't hesitate to spread her misinformation on all the major misinformation platforms where Gen Z incels get all their news, like Joe Rogan's disgrace of a podcast. I'm going to show you how she and the rest of her ilk deliberately misconstrue the data and are dishonest in how they present it. They do this by purposely confounding two completely different studies with similar sounding names and making bad faith accusations. They claim Ancel Keys didn't include France in his studies because of the so-called French paradox, which is something that wasn't even described until years after his studies were published. Another dishonest tactic they rely on is they'll claim that Ancel Keys ignored sugar in his studies and that sugar is the real culprit for heart disease, not saturated fat. None of these accusations turn out to be even remotely true. Ancel Keys started his major research back in the 1950s. At the time, the death rate from heart disease was at its highest it had ever been. You can see this in the left side of this graph. After Keys' research was published and the guidelines were established to limit saturated fat, the mortality from heart disease has taken a nosedive. It has, however, plateaued just in the last few years, and that's probably from the rise of unhealthy diets like the carnivore diet. Certainly there have been other factors to be factored in, like the decrease in tobacco use and advances in coronary care, but the fact remains remains that reducing saturated fat in the diet has been associated with an incredible decrease in cardiovascular disease. Ancel Keys played a major role in this decrease with his research, so his work has helped save millions of people's lives. He's a hero, not a villain. In 1953, he published this paper entitled, quote, Atherosclerosis, a problem in newer public health, unquote. This is a long article talking about what was known about the causes of atherosclerosis at the time, but the study is most famous because it included this graph here. The graph simply plots the death rate from heart disease taken from each country's national vital statistics against the average percent of caloric intake from the fats garnered from each country's dietary statistics. There are two curves shown, one for men aged 45 to 49, and the other for men aged 55 to 59. Also, you should note that the mortality data is from 1948 to 1949, and the dietary data was gathered from United Nations statistics published in 1949. As is evident, there is a tight correlation between dietary fat consumption and cardiac mortality. Notice also that this graph is looking at total fat consumption. It's not looking at saturated fat or cholesterol intake specifically. Because the graph included 6 countries, this 1953 study by Ancel Keys is often called the 6-country study. Though some people notice that he combined England and Wales into one country, so sometimes it is mistakenly referred to as the 7-country study. That's incredibly confusing because there was a completely different study designed by Ancel Keys called the 7-country study. We'll get to what that was in a moment, but one of the problems I found is that people accidentally, or perhaps on purpose, confound these two different studies to accuse Dr. Keys of claiming things that he didn't actually claim back in 1953. Ancel Keys detractors often present this graph as if it came from the later 7-country study and claim that Ancel Keys cherry-picked the countries to prove his point. That's completely wrong. What's actually true, though, is that Keys chose those countries because they had the most reliable data at the time. Remember, the data was from 1949, just 4 years after the end of World War II. Germany and the occupied countries during the war, like France, had considerable changes in their diets during the war, as well as difficulties in record-keeping that made them impractical to include in the study. So Keys just selected what was the most robust data at the time. Also, this first study by Keys was not the end of the story. The later 7-country study provided much stronger evidence of the link between diet and heart disease. In fact, Keys originally drew a relatively weak conclusion from this association. He said, quote, whether or not cholesterol, etc. are involved, it must be concluded that dietary fat is somehow associated with cardiac disease mortality, at least in middle age, unquote. Does that sound like someone who is biased or agenda-driven? If he set out to prove a point before doing research, then he wouldn't have said something like that. That quote proves that he was actually pretty skeptical of the cholesterol hypothesis at the time. Keys felt that the data was just at the hypothesis generating stage, and further research needed to be done to prove the link between diet and heart disease to understand it better. You know, what real scientists do. But this was a completely novel idea at the time. The idea that lifestyle changes could affect the incidence of heart disease, which is something everyone takes for granted today, was a new concept during the 1950s. Today, everyone thinks diet affects health. Even the carnivore dieters think that their diet is better for their health than other diets, which of course it isn't true, but the whole concept that something like diet can affect health is an idea that we owe to Dr. Keys. So, despite Keys' pretty low-key conclusion that dietary fat had something to do with heart disease, the idea was immediately criticized, even back in the 1950s. Here's an article published in 1957, which is frequently used even today by cholesterol deniers to try to debunk Keys. The article included this graph, which plots the mortality from atherosclerosis and heart disease versus the percent of calories consumed as fat, but this time in 22 countries, not 6. The first thing I would note from this graph is that there is still an association between fat consumption and mortality, though the association is not as tight as what was seen in Dr. Keys' 6-country study. In fact, this study primarily criticized Keys' methodology and did not disagree with his conclusions. The 22-country analysis did show a correlation between fat consumption and heart disease mortality using these 22 countries. In fact, the strongest correlation was between animal protein consumption and heart disease mortality, which of course the same people who tout this study as proof that Keys was wrong totally ignore. Animal protein and animal-based saturated fat go together, so this correlation strengthens the argument that saturated fat is the big problem here. And as far as cherry-picking countries goes, Yerushalmy and Hilleboe, the authors of the 1957 study, only included 22 countries, even though there was data available from 36 countries. So this sounds like projection. They were guilty of doing the very thing they accused Ancel Keys of doing, cherry picking. It turns out the data from the 22 countries they chose came from a different time than the data that Keys used, which you remember was data from 1948 and 1949. Yerushalmy and Hilleboe used statistics from 1950 to 1953, so there's no way Keys could have combined the country data they used with this data from 1948 and 1949. But all this doesn't really matter, because this 1957 study didn't actually deny that there was a correlation between fat consumption and heart disease. It just said that the correlation was not as strong as Keys claimed. It also emphasized that correlation does not mean causation. That's particularly true of their data because they used dietary data from 1954 to analyze mortality data from 1950 to 1952. Causality doesn't work backwards in time like that. In fact, it takes years of a high saturated fat diet to produce atherosclerosis, which is a bit disappointing because it means these carnivore influencing grifters on YouTube are going to be around for quite a while. This study was done long before the Bradford-Hill criteria for establishing causality that was first published in 1965. But in any case, both Keys' first study and this more critical study from 1957 were just considered hypothesis generating, not definitive proof of the so-called diet heart theory. But Keys went on to try to prove the connection, and this is where the true 7-country study comes into the picture. The 7-country study was specifically designed to answer the question, can certain diets increase the risk of heart disease? Most of the cholesterol deniers today either ignore the actual results of the 7-country study, or like I said before, they confuse it with the Ancel Keys' first study on diet and heart disease that was published way back in 1953. They point out the weakness of that study, which was just a hypothesis-generating observation, like I already said, and then they pretend that that's all the data that has ever existed on the subject. Nothing could be further from the truth. Heart disease is literally the most thoroughly researched human pathology in existence, and the 7-country study was just the very beginning. The real 7-country study started in 1958 and included over 50 years of follow-up data. It has generated over 550 peer-reviewed publications in 10 books. Analysis of the data continues to generate new papers even today. With so much data scattered over so many publications, it's a lot easier for cholesterol deniers to just pick on Dr. Keys' first publication from 1953 and to pretend that that is all he's ever published on the subject. So let me go ahead and briefly summarize the study. The study followed 16 groups of people in the 7 countries shown here. The groups were chosen specifically because of known cultural and local variations in their diet. If the researchers had chosen groups of people with similar diets, it would be impossible to prove that differences in diet would lead to different outcomes. So, instead, they chose groups with diets that differed a lot in the amounts of meat versus vegetables, or the amount of butter versus vegetable oils, and so forth. There were a total of 12,763 men enrolled in the study, all between the ages of 40 to 59 years old. The men had baseline serum cholesterol levels measured. Their blood pressure and their BMI were also measured. An electrocardiogram, along with their medical history, smoking history, and level of physical activity were all recorded. Their diets were recorded based on 7-day diet diaries, and these diets were validated by the investigators. All the measurements as well as outcomes were assessed again after 5 years, 10 years, 25 years, and even 50 years. This is one of the longest health studies that has ever been conducted, if not the very longest. The outcome endpoints were cardiovascular mortality and all-cause mortality. All deaths were independently validated by the investigators based not just on death certificates, but direct contact with family members, physicians, and review of hospital records. So this was a very, very robust study we're talking about here, chums. It was not just based on dietary surveys or national death rate statistics. This was a prospective cohort observational study that followed the study subjects very closely for a long period of time. It has nothing to do with the 1953 Ancel Keys study that Ancel Keys detractors constantly quote. The results of the 7-country studies were clear-cut. Cardiovascular mortality was directly related to total serum cholesterol levels. When looking at diet, there was a direct correlation between the level of saturated fat in their diet and the cardiovascular mortality rate. So, men from countries with the highest consumption of saturated fat, like Finland in the study, had the highest cholesterol levels and the highest death rates from heart disease, while men from countries with the lowest consumption of saturated fat and lowest cholesterol levels had the lowest death rate from heart disease. It seems very clear-cut here. So what are the criticisms that the carnivore death cultists bring up, other than confounding the 7-country study with the 6-country study from 1953? Well, one criticism is the claim that Ancel Keys excluded France from the study on purpose because of the so-called French paradox. The French paradox states that people in France have a low amount of heart disease despite eating a diet that is high in saturated fat. The truth is that France was invited to participate in the 7-country study, but France itself backed out, probably because the study was expensive and very labor-intensive, so the French just decided that it wasn't worth it for them. It's also stupid to say that Keys ignored the French paradox, because in 1958, when the study began, the term French paradox hadn't even been coined yet. In fact, the term French paradox didn't even occur in the medical literature until the 1980s. Now, I know it's inevitable at this point that some butthurt cholesterol denialist who loves to shove greasy globs of butter and steak into their pudgy gob is writing in the comment section right now, "But Kevin, what about that graph with the 22 countries? Doesn't it show that France had a low incidence of heart disease? You can't deny that fact, bro." Well, let's look at that graph again. France is country number 8, which I've highlighted in red. The first thing I'll point out in this graph is that France did not have a particularly high consumption of fat. As you can see, the total fat calorie consumption of France was less than 30%, which is actually well within the published dietary guidelines for Americans, even the versions of those guidelines before RFK Jr. took over and ruined everything. It is not amongst the countries with the highest fat consumption like Finland. The reason France wasn't included in the original 1953 Ancel Keys graph was the fact that the French statistics from the late 1940s and early 1950s were not trustworthy. France had food rationing after World War II that didn't conclude until 1949, so dietary data from that time period would not reflect a typical French diet before the war. Also, the dietary data from France was just not that reliable. Even the study that published the 22-country graph could not get good dietary data from France. The mortality data from France at the time is also untrustworthy. Most of the heart disease death data in the French national statistics were misclassified as, quote, other diseases of the heart, unquote, and they were not included in the analysis of the 22-country graph. If you correct for this mistake, France, which is the small red circle in the middle of the graph, actually fits the curve well. So, this whole idea that Ancel Keys knowingly excluded France on purpose because it would mess up his data is totally unsubstantiated bullshit, and it is not backed up by any facts. Another criticism that anti-Keys nutcases make is that the 7-country study didn't look at the sugar intake. These people claim that it's not saturated fat, it's sugar that causes heart disease, and Ancel Keys totally missed that. Of course, that's also nonsense, but it's also a false dichotomy. Cholesterol denialists like to pretend that only sugar can cause heart disease, and it's not possible that maybe both sugar and saturated fat cause heart disease. But the real truth is that the 7-country study did in fact look at sugar intake, and it even found an association between sugar intake and heart disease. However, that association disappeared when the levels of saturated fat intake were taken into account when using a statistical method called a multivariate analysis. That doesn't mean that sugar is good for you or that you should replace saturated fat with sugar. Of course you shouldn't. But it does mean that the criticism that Ancel Keys ignored sugar in the 7-country study is completely bogus. So, Ancel Keys was a health pioneer. His studies weren't perfect, but they were state-of-the-art for the 1950s when they were started. And his best vindication is that he turned out to be right about everything. He literally got nothing wrong. There are countless studies that validate the association between dietary saturated fat consumption and LDL cholesterol levels, and there are countless more being conducted even today that continue to validate his conclusions again without any fail. The research proves via the Bradfield-Hill criteria that LDL cholesterol is a causative agent in the genesis of atherosclerosis. Ancel Keys critics ignore the 7-country study and just criticize him for a graph he published in 1953. Even though it was based on crude data by today's standards, it turned out to be completely true. Keys' main contribution was the radical at the time idea that the risk of heart disease was modifiable by lifestyle changes. After the 1950s and 60s, people started eating less saturated fat, they stopped smoking, they started exercising more, and the result has been an incredible decrease in heart disease. The only thing stopping further progress is ignorant non-scientists like RFK Jr. who want to turn back the clock to the 1950s. His supporters are so unfathomably stupid that they think the real reason we're so unhealthy is because we're not cooking our French fries in beef tallow. Hell, forget heart disease. They'll probably die from drowning in their own saliva. The only thing that has impressed me about RFK Jr. so far is that he hasn't recommended people consume more tobacco, but maybe that's next. He's already encouraging people to eat more steak as if they could actually afford it in today's shitty tariff-driven economy, and he has loosened the recommendations to limit alcohol, even though doctors today have concluded overwhelmingly that there is no safe level of alcohol consumption. Even a glass of wine per week or a beer per week is still too much for your health. People from the 1960s and 70s actually used to make fun of the idea that the future would become some health dystopia. I mean, just look at this clip from the 1973 Woody Allen film titled Sleeper.
Has he asked for anything special?
Yes, this morning for breakfast. He requested something called wheat germ, organic honey, and tiger's milk.
Oh, yes, those are the charmed substances that some years ago were felt to contain life-preserving properties.
You mean there was no deep fat? No steak or cream pies or hot fudge?
Those were thought to be unhealthy. Precisely the opposite of what we now know to be true.
Incredible.
This shit has now become an official reality, and it's only going to get worse and worse because the entire population is hopelessly addicted to their smartphones, where people will spend 18 hours a day hunched over on their screen while curated algorithms will feed them sensationalist brain rot designed to keep them addicted to their screens for as long as possible so that they're exposed to more of the shitty ads that generate revenue for all these big tech billionaires like Mark Schmuckerberg and Elon Putz. There's a lot more I've said about the carnivore diet on this channel, so I won't belabor the point any further. I've done several videos on why the carnivore diet is complete nonsense and why seed oils are a good alternative to lard, beef tallow, and butter, and I'll go ahead and link those below. So go ahead and watch them unless you're too scared to have your biases challenged, of course. The bottom line is that the link between saturated fat in the diet, LDL cholesterol levels, and heart disease is strong, and it is causal. We have Ancel Keys to thank for pointing us in the right direction, but he is far from the only researcher who has forged the links of this causal chain. Oh yeah, I should also mention that Ancel Keys is definitely someone who practiced what he preached. He ate a Mediterranean diet, and he lived to be 100 years old, which is longer than any carnivore diet has ever lived and will ever live. So please, quit being a bitch and eat some goddamn fruits and vegetables. I'm out.